Folks, welcome into the Reimagine LA community listening session. We are so excited to be here today to speak with you all about what you want to see funded in your communities. There are a lot of services that are currently being funded that work for some of our communities and some that don't. And so we really just want to get down to the bottom of it and meet you all here in this Zoom room to be able to really discuss the issues that we see in our communities and the solutions that we think could help them. Historically, LA County's budgeting decisions have harmed a lot of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, and we want to try to advocate to stop that, right? So here we are today, and we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna get started. Today, we can go ahead and go to our next slide. We'll go over our agenda for the night and we'll get started. Alrighty, so the focus of tonight's trainings, obviously the big goal tonight is to really hear from you all. So we'll have a robust discussion later on in our agenda. But the first thing on our agenda is a little bit of just background of who we are, who is Reimagine LA, where did we come from, an overview of the Care First budget campaign. And then we'll get into a little bit of a presentation from our partners at Catalyst California, where we'll be diving into the LA County recommended budget, and we'll be talking about what's actually in the budget. I know some folks may be aware of what's been in the budget and have dived deep in the budget and have been like doing this work, but some folks may not be as familiar. So we want to make sure that we are educating folks and just making sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the budget. And then we will get into a community discussion where we'll all talk about, we have a few guiding questions that will be guiding us tonight, and we'll talk about the issues that we see in the services that we think could help those services. And then we'll end out the night. And I will go ahead and pass it over to Karen for our land and labor acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Maya. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I will be leading our land and labor acknowledgement. This land, which we inhabit, is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Tongva, Chumash, and Gabrielino people. We pay respect to the Tongva, Chumash, Gabrielino, and all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and honor their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout their historical diaspora. We respectfully acknowledge our debt to the enslaved people, primarily of African descent, whose labor and suffering built and grew the economy and infrastructure of a nation that refused to recognize their humanity. We recognize our debt to exploited workers, past and present, whose labor was and continues to be stolen through unjust practices. We acknowledge our collective debt to the Indigenous peoples of this land, whose labor was forced and exploited. We recognize the immigrant and American-born workers of African, Asian, and Central and South American descent, whose labor remains hidden in the shadows but still contributes to the well-being of our collective community. Thank you so much, everyone, and I'll pass it back to Maya.
Thank you, Karen. It's always important. We like to center ourselves and give acknowledgements to the necessary folks. So I will go ahead and kick it over to my colleague Megan from La Defensa and Reimagine LA to give us an overview of the Care First budget campaign.
Thank you so much, Maya. Good evening, everyone. My name is Megan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Policy and Advocacy Manager at La Defensa and the Coalition Coordinator for the Reimagine LA Coalition. It's a pleasure to be in space. But just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to dive into who we are as a coalition.
I love comma, I'm facilitating.
Who we are as a coalition and how we continue to move this work, and just kind of a bit of background. So the Reimagine LA Coalition, we are a coalition of community organizations, service providers, advocates, and everyday residents who really came together to pass the ballot measure, Measure J, which passed in 2020 and was designed to allocate over 10% or a minimum 10% of the county's unrestricted net county cost towards alternatives to incarceration and community-based organizations. Since then, Measure J has been challenged in the court, but we've saw wins where in 2023, the court ruled in our favor, stating that Measure J is in fact constitutional, and that Measure J should be reinstated as a county charter. And so today we have seen over $500 to $600 million be allocated directly toward community-based organizations and alternatives to incarceration. And we continue to do that work today. Next slide, please. As stated, there's been a long railroad of organizing that has really gone into this work around how we got to Measure J, beginning, and really doesn't really begin, but for now, in 2013, LA County advocates began fighting for the stoppage of jail expansion here in Los Angeles County, where they fought for alternatives to incarceration and really began to seed those seeds around, again, stopping jail expansion here in Los Angeles County. Fast forward to 2019, the LA County Board of Supervisors scrapped the idea of building a new jail facility. And I think it was like a $3.5 million plan to build a new jail here in Los Angeles County. And that was really all due to the deep organizing that has gone into building the framework for alternatives to incarceration. Fast forward to 2019 and 2020, we began to see LA County develop what was known as the ATI work group, or the Alternatives to Incarceration work group, which was established and created 114 recommendations for what we now know as the Care First Jails Last vision for Los Angeles County. And I must say that this ATI work group brought together community-based organizations, service providers, county departments, as well as board staff and philanthropy, which all came together to really develop this plan for the Care First Jails Last vision. Fast forward to 2020, against the backdrop of the massive defund the police and Black Lives Matter movement that we saw, which I also like to call Freedom Summer of 2020, we seized the opportunity to get Measure J on the ballot. And so it was introduced by our coalition and passed by 2.1 million voters who said, yes, we actually want to invest in alternatives to incarceration and make sure that our community-based organizations are resourced to build that robust social safety network. And again, fast forward to 2024, where we find ourselves today, where we have not seen the full realization of Measure J funding. As stated, it's supposed to be 10% of the county's unrestricted net county costs. And I believe my colleague Myanna is going to share a little bit about that calculations there. But 10% of the county's unrestricted net county cost, as we understand it, is supposed to be $900 million annually. And since then, we've seen the board allocate $100 to, $100 million annually toward this effort. And one of the unique things about Measure J in particular is that the funding is supposed to roll over. And so every year the county builds upon this funding stream. And so again, to date, we see roughly $600 million allocated toward this effort. And so some of the things that we continue to push for as a coalition, of course, is the closure of the Men's Central Jail facility without a replaced locked center. And this is really, really central to our work. The reason why Measure J came to be was because as folks continue to champion for jail closure, we continue to hear we can't close the jail because there aren't enough resources, there aren't enough services for folks who will be exiting the jails. And so we had the foresight to say, okay, well, let's build and be intentional about building an infrastructure to catch people as they are being released, and also to prevent people from going in to begin with. And so, as you all know, Men's Central Jail continues to be open. And while we are seeing the decline in the population overall, the jail continues to stand and is continuing to perpetuate very harmful situations for the folks that are on the inside, both staff and folks that are held. Our second demand, of course, is to fully fund Care First community investment. So as shared, Measure J was held up in the court, and so the county had to move towards new language around what Measure J is, and so we toggle between Measure J and Care First community investment. Nonetheless, we continue to fight for the full funding of Measure J, which again should be at least $900 million annually. Third, our third demand is to fund the Care First budget by leveraging dollars from CFCI or Measure J and other local, state, and federal resources like ARPA or then ARPA and AB 109 funding. And the reason why we state it this way is because CFCI or Measure J is just a particular bucket of funding. We are coming for the entire thing. We are looking for our entire LA County budget to be reflective of our values. And so that is why we continue to fight for an overall Care First budget. Fourth, divest from probation and robustly fund the Department of Youth Development and Youth Justice Reimagine. This is central to our work. Our partners on the ground at Layup, at Urban Peace Institute, at the Children's Defense Fund, Youth Justice Coalition are deeply, deeply, deeply organizing and have seeded incredible wins around Youth Justice Reimagine, particularly with the creation of DYD and YDD. And so we continue to make sure that as we champion for the investment of services, that is paired with the divestment of those harmful systems as well. And lastly, and certainly not least, this idea of co-governance, right? What does it look like for us to commit to building the Care First vision through authentic community collaboration, power sharing, and participatory budgeting to ensure that we have consistent and equitable investment ongoing? And this is important for us because we'd like to see participatory be taken up as a core tenet and as a core function of the way that the county does their budget. We've seen this kind of happen where we've kind of launched our pilot with Supervisorial District 2, where there are two unincorporated areas that are engaging in our participatory budgeting pilot. And so we are continuing to drop those seeds as this is a viable way to ensure that our values are reflected in our budgets. And without further ado, I will pass it to my colleague, Myanna, to kind of help break down what is happening in our current budget.
Thank you, Megan. And so excited to be here. We're now going to look into what's actually in the LA County FY25, which is our fiscal year 25, the current budget cycle that we're in, recommended budget. Next slide, please. So a little introduction about who Catalyst is and the team that I'm with, the Equity and Community Investments team. Megan just did a great job of reviewing Measure J, so we'll just hit like some highlight points. And then we'll go into some different departmental breakdowns, looking at the sheriff's budget, probation's budget, and then CFCI dollars, which is our Care First Community Investment dollars, and then look at budget timeline and next steps. Next slide, please. So we are Catalyst California. We are a racial justice data research and policy org that strives for a world where systems are designed for justice and also support equitable access to resources and opportunities for all Californians to thrive. And our mission is to advocate for racial justice by building power and also transforming public systems. And we do this by partnering with communities of color, conducting innovative research, developing policies for actionable change, and also shifting money and power back to our communities. Next slide, please. And we are different program areas, but we are part of the Equity and Community Investments team. And our team works to shift money and power back into our communities. The program focuses on equipping BIPOC communities with tools necessary to win sustainable investments. And we do that by conducting in-depth budget analysis, funding, transparency, and accountability, and also providing budget training and capacity building. Next slide, please. Now we're going to look into local budget basics and get into what are local budgets and what are some key terms. Awesome. So what are local budgets? Budgets in general are forward-looking financial plans. They're a projection on what will happen, and where investments will go. So it is a plan that your jurisdiction lays out to say, how are they spending money? Budgets are supposed to reflect the priorities and values of a community and repair historic disinvestment, but often that's not the case. So this is why spaces like this and the work that we do in budget advocacy is so important, because we want our budgets to reflect our priorities and the priorities of our communities. Cool. Now we're going to get into some key budget terms and just break down some language that you may hear when you're looking at budgets or talking about budgets. So first is the fiscal year, or you're like FY25, and that's the time period for a traditional city or county budget, which begins on July 1st of a calendar year and ends June 30th of the following year. So the budget cycle we're in now is FY25. And we're talking about the budget that they're working on from October to when we see in April, they're working on FY26 or fiscal year 26. When you hear revenue, revenue is money that's coming in, and those include taxes, fees, grants from state or grants from federal government. When you hear expenditures, that's money going out or how a county is spending its revenue. So that's how a county is paying for its programming, its services, and its staff. And then lastly is net county costs. Those are our most flexible dollars. Those are the dollars that can be spent on anything. There's no rules in how that money can be spent. And that can be used for community programming. So when we talk about budget advocacy, those are the dollars that we are likely targeting. It's also known as our locally generated revenues. A large percent of that fund is property taxes. So when we're talking about Measure J or CFCI, it's 10% of our net county costs, our most flexible dollars. Next slide. Great. And then lastly, we wanted to break down budget cycle or budget phases. So a fiscal year goes through different budget phases. And so the first thing we wanted to talk about is the recommended budget, and that's the budget that we are pulling figures from for this presentation. And we want you to think about that as the first draft. So this is the first draft that the CEO brings out and creates to present to the board. It usually comes out between mid-April when we're talking about a traditional budget cycle. Budget hearings and deliberations occur based off this draft of the budget. And this year, the recommended budget came out on April 22nd. The next phase is the adopted budget. This is the budget that's adopted and approved by the board in June. So the recommended budget came out, there were different budget hearings, there were different things, changes that could be made, and then those changes are made and put into the adopted budget, and then that is what the board adopts and approves, and that is when the budget cycle starts. And then the next cycle is our supplemental budget. This is when we had mid-year adjustments to the budget that comes out usually between September or October. And this is based off some of the things that are happening at the state level, usually additional funding and one-time investments. And this year, it'll be on the board calendar to be presented on October 8th. Next slide. Okay, we're going to get a little bit into Measure J. Next slide, please. And Megan did a great job talking about how we got to Measure J, the history of Measure J. So really just want to uplift that a Care First vision for Los Angeles was due to decades of work done by advocates and community members to move away from a system of harm model and into a community system of care. And this system includes alternatives to incarceration, but also reimagining public safety that does not include over-policing, violence, and surveillance. So what advocates and community members understood was that to have this new model, there needed to be a dedicated funding stream, and that is what Measure J was for. It was a community initiative to ensure that the needed community programming had sustainable funding to provide those services. Next slide, please. In a little bit, touch on what Megan already laid a good foundation for. What did Measure J do? It was at least a 10% set aside of our locally generated unrestricted revenues, which we know are our net county costs, our NCCs, for direct community investments and alternatives to incarceration. What it cannot be used for was anything for law enforcement priorities, and Measure J provided a community-centered engagement process for spending allocation. So it had to go through a community process for us to know how those dollars should be spent. And that was done through an advisory board to recommend how dollars should be allocated. And so in short, Measure J is a community-centered budgeting process that is for community, by community, to community. And next slide, please. Awesome. Now we're going to get into the actual budget data. So first, for our FY25, we saw an overall increase of revenues. So what that means is from our last budget cycle, this budget cycle saw an increase of $390 million than we saw last time. And so even though this was a large growth, the CEO and the budget said that this is a slower growth than we've seen in previous years. So these funds are needed for certain things. So think about these funds, even though they're new dollars coming into LA County, they're already being accounted for. And they're being accounted for substantial increases to wages and benefits for the county's workforce, growing public assistance caseload costs, legal settlements, and board priorities that include CFCI. For this recommended budget, the 10% set aside, so the calculation of Measure J from our net county costs was around $300 million. Noting that only $12.3 million were new dollars from CFCI. So Megan told us that our Measure J CFCI dollars are rollover dollars. So our next bullet that talks about the CEO included $223 million of carryover dollars. Those were unspent dollars from previous fiscal years that carried on to this year of CFCI. So the total allocation for this year was $524 million. So they added what the 10% calculation is, the $300 million, plus the 223 of carryover dollars. And that's how we get to the $524 million. Next slide, please. And then some additional Care First community investments that we see in the budget is our independent pretrial services, and then also our Department of Justice consent decree. And so for our independent trial services, we see an addition of 24 staff positions to support the initial launch of the pretrial services program. The staff are to oversee the contracted community-based organizations delivering the supportive services to the pretrial individuals, but also help to link them to comprehensive care management services. The Department of Justice consent decree provides around $4 million of ongoing funding to the Department of Justice, and that's really to build out the mental services group, health group, to provide additional services to individuals in high observation housing to receive structured out of cell time in county jails. In addition to that, we also see a $9 million set aside for body-worn cameras to increase transparency and accountability in custody. And the narrative around that is that this investment continues the county's commitment to improve conditions in mental health. So we're seeing that these investments in pretrial services will aid in goals to decrease the jail population and close men's central jail. But we also want to acknowledge that, yes, investment in the mental health division within the jail is supportive on its face and good on its face, but we really want to focus on shifting those dollars and our perspective to releasing individuals that need mental health services instead of locking them up in jails and criminalizing them. Next slide, please. I think it's the stall on my, okay. And so these next few slides are going to go into departmental breakdowns. So we're going to have our sheriff, probation, and CFCI, and then we're going to see some comparative graphs to see like what are some trends that we're seeing when we're talking about how funds are being prioritized and allocated. So first we have the Sheriff's Department. This graph will show us a breakdown of revenues, salaries and employee benefits, that's our S&EB, their net total expenditure, so that is basically all of the money it takes to run that department, and then we'll see how much NCC contribution each department gets. The next column gives the amount that was allocated for our FY25 recommended budget, and the last column is what was the change from the previous year. So either additional money was added to this department, or if you see something in parentheses in red, it was a decrease in that department. So we see that for the Sheriff's Department, it's upwards of $3.8 billion for that department to run. This is an increase of $88.9 million from our last budget cycle. We also see that the NCC contribution that they get is $1.9 billion. So their revenues that they see that they bring in, money coming from the state, money coming from different services, taxes and fees, money come the federal government, matches their NCC contribution. And it's rare that you see that in any other department. So this department also saw an increase of $82.8 million of NCC from the previous year. We see that their biggest expenditure is salary and employee benefits. That makes up the bulk of this department. This department is basically paying for people and paying for staff. This department has 17,544 employees, one of the largest departments in LA County when we look at staff. And they also saw an increase of 25 positions for this fiscal year. On average, this department, an average officer in this department makes around $209,000 in salary and benefits a year. When we look into the custodial division, so that's the division that handles the jails, they are spending around $990 million, and the amount of NCCs that division is getting is $486 million. So almost as much as CFCI is getting, they're getting for just the jail division. Next slide, please. Moving to our probation department. So same breakdown, our probation department is seeing around $1.1 billion for it to be able to function and operate as a department. They saw an increase of $9.2 million from our last budget cycle. They have around $716 million of NCC contributing to this department, and they also bring in upwards of $400 million in revenues. Their NCC contribution went up by $12.2 million since our last budget cycle, and some of that is due to the board approving increases in salaries and health insurance subsidies. This department has around 5,545 employees within this department, and they saw a deletion of 27 positions, but some of that was because they needed to offset the increase in workers' compensation. So what they did is they deleted 27 positions so they can pay higher per person with the positions that they still have. On average, a probation officer is making around $160,000 a year. Probation saw a decrease of $3 million in revenue from our last budget cycle, but some of that was due to some of the state funding that comes into that department, but that was offset by an increase in some other funding of AB 18 that the department sees. Next slide. And now we're going to get into CFCI. CFCI is not a department, as we talked about before. It's a 10% set aside that's in LA County's charter of our net county cost. And so we see that this year it was allotted $524 million. From last year, we saw an increase of $64 million, but that was some of it from the carryover unspent funds. but we know that we only got an additional 12.3 million. And then noting that our net county cost makes up all of these dollars. There are no additional revenues coming into CFCI funds. It's just the 10% that's coming from our net county costs. Also want to uplift that the county care initiatives are getting far less funding than what we're seeing in our sheriff's and probation departments. And awesome. So we are now, this slide is getting at how the CFCI dollars were allocated to departments. And so we see that the CFCI dollars went to a lot of different departments that are looking at community care services, which is such a great thing. We see children and family services, youth development, public defender, economic opportunity, health services. So that's great that we're seeing these dollars reaching so many different departments. We see a bulk of the allocation is going to health services and our JCOT, jails, care, and opportunities department, which does a lot of the alternatives to incarceration community programming programs. And that we also want to note that $57.7 million has yet to be allocated. So that's a good pressure point for our budget advocates and our community members, because we know $57 million can go a long way and that our community needs all the money that it can. So we can, urge our public official, urge our CEO, our board of supervisors to say, like, why isn't this money being allocated? How can we get this money on the ground to our communities? Next slide, please. And now we're going to start going into different comparisons and trends conversations. So on this graph, we see the blue column is our sheriff's graph, sheriff's department. The lime yellow is our probation's department, and our lavender is our CFCI. And so this is looking at a comparison of FY25's recommended budget, the departmental total expenditures. This is how much money the county allocated to these different departments. And we see that the blue column far exceeds anything compared to our lavender column. And so much more also from our probation column. And so noting that the sheriff's budget is 151% larger than our Care First community initiatives. And so also what we want to uplift is we're going to see this trend across all the different graphs that we see. So next slide, please. So we just looked at our total expenditure. So that's how a budget functions, all of the money needed. This is now looking at our NCC, so our most flexible dollars and how much it is given to each department. And we see a similar trend for our NCCs. The sheriff is getting 114% more of our most flexible dollars than our Care First community initiatives, and probation is getting 31% more than CFCI. But also noting that both the sheriff and the probation department have their own streams of revenues when CFCI only has our NCC contribution of 10%. And so now we're looking at trends across 3 years. So this is a multi-year comparison for departmental total expenditures. The colors are consistent. So blue column is going to be sheriff's, lime yellow and lime green yellow is going to be probation, and our lavender is going to be CFCI. And so across the 3 years, you see that there hasn't been much change or much shift. And we continue to see the county prioritizing the sheriff's department at steady rates. But we also see that there is a growth between FY23 and 24. Some of that is because CFCI was a part of like a 3-year ramp up. Some of it is because of some rollover dollars and how some of the accounting for CFCI is done. But also want to uplift that we do see growth, and we also see steadiness across fiscal years when we look at 24 and 25. But noting the victory of community and advocates and organizations like RELA, where 2 or 3 years ago, we didn't have any money, right? Or we didn't have as much money, $524 million going to community. So wanted to really uplift that victory and that this work, this budget advocacy, the hard things that everyone is doing, community members are doing, is really showing up. And this slide is now getting into our NCC contribution. So again, we see similar trends of our county prioritizing the sheriff, but also wanting to note that probation is still getting a lot of money, more than our CFCI dollars. And when we combine the sheriff and probation contribution, they're getting over 200% more than CFCI dollars. So that is combining the blue and the lime yellow graphs together. So now we're getting to what can we do? What does this mean? And what we can do as community members, as advocates, continue to attend budget town halls and trainings, create community demands, communicate with their local officials, tweet them, email them, call them, go to their office, make sure you're really in communication with them, use toolkits and other materials to help inform you. Coalitions like RELA create materials that are really accessible and can help with advocacy. And also tune into any budget meetings to really inform decision making, like public hearings and budget deliberations. And then lastly, to look at the typical budget timeline. So next slide, please. So this is giving us like, what does a typical budget timeline look like? So from now, well, we're in September. So looking at October all the way until March, this is when the budget is being prepared and being developed. So this is when we should be looking at the budget from last year, talking to our community, making our demands. So when we go and build those relationships with department heads, with the board of supervisors, with their budget deputies, we can let them know like, hey, this is where we want our money to be spent in our community. This is where we want programs to be expanded. This is where we're seeing gaps. So we can really help build that into the budget cycle. Because if we wait until April when it's in the public, it's kind of too late to really make any substantial changes. When we get to April and May, that is when the budget is released to the public. That's when budget hearings are happening. And then in June, the budget is adopted. And then we get into the start of that budget cycle. And in September, we have our in-year budget changes, our supplemental budget. And thank you.
Thank you, Myanna. That was so much information, which it still always just blows my mind all the time. And so we do have maybe about like if folks, if you have any questions for Myanna, please drop them in the chat and we can follow up with those questions. I know it was a lot of information that we just went over. And now we're going to get into the let's talk about it portion, where we'll be having a community discussion to talk about what are the solutions and services that you feel like will help your communities. And so tonight it's going to be a little bit interactive. I'm going to need some community participation from you all. And I wanted to highlight a piece that Myanna was just speaking about inside of the budget timeline. She mentioned that we're in the October, well, we are coming up in the October through March phase of the budget timeline, where it's the preparation for next year's budget. And so that's a big reason why we're here tonight and why we're having this conversation, so we can really hear from you all and it can help us develop our demands that we bring for our meetings with our department heads and our demands that we have next year. And I do see one question from Max for Myanna, which is how much of the money goes to housing vouchers through CFCI? If you have any insight on that.
Yeah, so a little bit for how little or much information you'll get from a budget. And so when the graph or the slide, when we gave to like where CFCI allocations are, the budget really gives you kind of like a full, not a full picture, but like a umbrella of $1.9 million went to this department. And you may or may not get any additional insight into like how that $1.9 million then shifted down to different programmings or different departments. So some of that might be some inquiry into which department got funds. So looking into the housing department or looking to different departments that are overseeing housing vouchers to get that additional information. But I can do a little homework and see if I can see any funding streams that went to housing vouchers and to see if that can be related back to or sourced back to CFCI. But some of that detail you may not get in a budget unless you go the extra step into like contacting the county or the department head that oversees that level of programming, if that was helpful.
Myanna. Yeah, it's actually kind of a frustrating thing, and that's why we're here advocating for budget transparency in so many different ways. But let's see, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if any other questions do come in, we can make sure to follow up and send those over to you, Myanna, and we can get answers to folks. Alrighty, so jumping into the community discussion, if we could have the Jamboard up on screen. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a little bit more of like an interactive part. We'll have opportunities for folks to be able to come off of mute, just use the raise your hand function, and we can answer these questions. And then I know some folks aren't really vocal and would like to share their opinions otherwise. So if we could drop the Jamboard in the chat as well, folks can feel free to click on the Jamboard and go in and write your answers to these questions on the sticky note, and we can just stick it there. And for folks that are going to be speaking in person, if you are able to drop your thought on a sticky note, that's great. If not, we have folks that will also be trying to help out and capture all of your thoughts, and it's recorded as well in case we were missing anything. And you will notice some of these questions are geared a little bit more towards service providers, and some of these questions are geared more towards community members. So if you feel free to answer like whatever you feel comfortable answering, and let's get into it. So the first question is, after just learning about the budget and hearing the presentations that we heard today, do you think the budget addresses the needs of all community groups, including marginalized or underserved populations? And why or why not? And feel free to use the chat function as well. Yes, I can repeat the question. So after learning what we just learned from the presentation, do you think this current budget addresses the needs of all community groups, including marginalized or underserved populations? And typically the marginalized or underserved populations are Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. And I can go ahead and get us started with this question tonight. Personally, through my work in the community and just being able to talk with folks and throughout tabling from different sessions this year, I don't feel like the budget addresses the needs of all community groups, because there are many people that are asking for specific programs like reentry services, like more housing programs. And I've gotten folks that have said that they want real mental health support. So it seems like there are things that are being addressed, but it doesn't seem to be adequately, and there are a lot of gaps that I have noticed. Seeing some notes coming in. I think the migrant community is left out of the budget, and in particular, Black migrants. I see Maya Daniels in the chat. There are so many intersectionalities and subgroups of people and help for specific needs that can only be developed through time. Very true. And I think that's a big part of like why we have these type of conversations and get together with community members from different walks of life and different backgrounds to be able to help develop these demands and these suggestions to help each of our groups of people. I'm seeing we would like to see more resources allocated for our elders. That's something I've heard quite frequently as well. Absolutely not. The board stated priorities are not matched in their budget allocations. 100%. I see a question, are Tay explicitly being called out for funding, or is that under the aegis of DYD? That question, I'm not exactly sure. I don't have an answer for you. But if no one else on the team or here has an answer, we can get that. We can do a little bit of research and follow up with you. Seeing that there could be more resources for pregnant women experiencing homelessness. It's powerful.
Agreed. To take a crack at the question that Remy put in the chat around Tay, I don't think they're explicitly being called out in a broader county budget. I do believe that they fall under funding for DYD, and there may be specific programming within DYD's budget that is allocated for Tay programming, if that makes sense. And so that this harkens back to Myanna's point about certain components of the budget are not as clear in the budget that's released. And so there is additional like digging that would have to take place within each departmental's budget, which we are beginning to embark on.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. And to Megan and Myanna's point from earlier about like building relationships with department heads, that's another reason why it's really important to develop these relationships, establish those relationships and continue to nurture them as we work together to help get information like that. Oftentimes department heads will be willing to share it because they want to receive more funding as well. Alrighty, seeing some more things coming up in the chat. Need more youth services. There's too much funding going towards oppressive police and prison systems that disproportionately harm poor people of color. Wow, so powerful. All right, we can go ahead and move forward to our next question. And if folks like, feel free if you have anything else that does come to your mind, like this Jamboard is accessible, you can still go ahead and add them in there. But just for the sake of time, because we have about 6 more questions to get through. So our next question is, what are the most pressing needs in our community that you feel should be addressed by the county's budget? So going back to Myanna's presentation, there is a certain amount of money that's allocated every year. Right now, this year's budget, I believe, was $44 billion. And it's somewhere around that point annually. So thinking through that, like what are the things that you would want to see funded the most in next year's budget? And again, feel free to come off mute, y'all. Y'all can raise your hand and speak out loud. This is your space. This is for the community tonight, and we really just want to center your thoughts and your feelings.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I can. Thank you. So this question tonight is about like what are the most pressing needs in our community that you feel should be addressed by in next year's budget?
There's a lot of layers that need to be addressed, but if we could, I think that financial literacy, teaching all individuals that come in, as well as probably people who even work for the institution, we spend a lot of money carelessly, and that needs to be addressed. Just putting a bunch of money, I've learned because I've worked hands-on with individuals who are giving so much where we have crippled and disabled them. And that's the worst thing that you can do, because they have been given so much and without any structural responsibility. I have clients on my caseload, families, that they got matched for Section 8. We have been telling them about getting their ID. We provided the ID vouchers, California vouchers. We provide Uber or Lyft for them to even go get them, and they won't even go get it. To be matched for their own permanent supportive housing. So I want you to know that area too. And I sadly say that because I thought I never would have to say that because I've been on both sides. But I've learned that there have to be some kind of teaching along packed along with the giving so that we can really help them help themselves to coming out of their own situation. And it's not a cookie cut, but we have to have some kind of structural conditions with some of this.
Yeah, thank you, LaShawn. I think financial literacy is definitely something that is needed and has helped me
Life
personally.
skills and life skills. Because a lot of we have about two generations that the mothers and fathers were removed, either working or on drugs. However, absentee is absentee, and the children had been left to kind of basically raise themselves, and it has not worked.
Yeah, thank you, LaShawn. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Sarah. Well, let's see. I think you're still on mute, Sarah. Let's see if I can get you to unmute.
Hey,
There we go.
and I've been sort of involved with all this since with this area, since the Measure J campaign. And I haven't been following things closely along, and it's really, really great to be here with you today. It's really great to see all these ideas. The question, it's not maybe under this particular category, but I'm wondering the extent to whether there are, who is looking at what kind of programs have been effective all over the country, and what programs in all of these areas, but what kind of programs that we might, duplicate out here. I mean, there's certainly a vibrant nonprofit community. I'm not saying let's start new organizations, but in fact, there might be programs that would be sort of a perfect fit for organizations that already exist, and it could be they just could get then more funding to help develop that. So that's what I was wondering about. how that development is going on.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's a great question and a great flag too, for us to be like making sure that we're always doing research on the different systems that are coming up across the United States and things that are happening in different places, like progressive places like Oregon and New York. Top of mind for me, one of the things that I've seen in other places that we're working on, like implementing slowly here in Los Angeles County, is participatory budgeting, as Megan had touched on earlier. We've seen that, you know, originating in Brazil and coming over into like many states in the United States. And we saw a process, the LA City process, and now we have started the first pilot for within the county process. So with this pilot being successful, we want to eventually, you know, move that into like a countywide thing to help try to put the funding and decisions more in the community members' hands. And that's just one way that I can think of that's coming up so far. But that's definitely something that we can continue to talk about more. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Coach Ron.
Yeah, good afternoon. I would like to see funding going to community cleanup, trash pickup, sanitation, homeless workforce development, training.
Yeah, I think that's good.
I think you accidentally muted yourself, Coach Ron, but maybe not. Maybe you were done.
Oh yeah, I was done. I just want to make sure some funds going to, you know, trash pickup, community cleanups, money to local CBOs to do just that. I know the bus stops and bicycle lanes are full of glass and filth. So it's like, you know, I like to see money that's directed towards CBOs to do community cleanups.
Thanks for naming that. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Megan.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, I was just going to offer another component to Sarah's question around just like modeling. One of the things that we've also been trying to push for, in particular as it pertains to jail closure, is also like an independent pretrial service agency. We know that in our jails, one of the largest populations is folks that are held pretrial. And so we've been trying to, you know, encourage the county to model after San Francisco's pretrial division, and the work that they're doing as they, you know, implement and invest in more community-based organizations that are doing pretrial service support. So that's just another example of like ways that we've been trying to push folks in the county. But it is a good note to just think through ways that we can continue to scale up. You know, just thinking about models that we know that work elsewhere, especially as we try to build our care first, you know, what our care first vision is here in the county. And plus to Coach Ron's point around like community cleanup, I just read an article recently that said Los Angeles, I think, is the second city with the largest rodent problems. So I think that's very, very on point.
Thanks, Megan. I was just shook for a second because I don't want to be in a city with the largest rodent problem. But I'll pass it back to Coach Ron, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next question.
No, I didn't have no more to say. Thank you.
Okay, old hand. All right, we can go ahead and move forward to the next question. And I see Rami has a great point that if we can make sure that that's captured from the chat as well. All right, the next question is, how well does the current budget align with the current needs and challenges faced by your organization or service area? So this one is geared a little bit more towards service providers. So if folks have any thoughts on this budget and their needs of their organization. Do you feel like the folks that you service at your organization are getting their needs met? Yeah, it doesn't seem like it aligns very well based on everything that we have talked about so far. But if folks do have any alternate opinions, you could place it in this slide. But if not, we can go ahead and move forward to the next question.
I also had something to say. Sorry, I didn't see the raise hand button.
Go for it, Max.
Yeah, I was curious because like for police, they have their unions, and their unions usually like negotiate like wages and stuff like that. For all of these programs, like who's negotiating the wages for all those workers? If it doesn't seem like there is a union, like for example, the nonprofits don't have the union, and so who gets to pick the salary of the sanitation worker or the person who does case management or the outreach worker? Like all of those salaries are way more below than police salaries. And is there like a way to compare the salaries that police are constantly getting versus the people who work in, like, let's say the care first realm, like wages? So just like seeing that some of this money is going to programs to fund like not even that many programs, and people's wages aren't changing, or the amount of workers per client. Because I think a big thing that fails too is caseworkers have way too many big loads, and there needs to be a whole team built around like people who have like disabilities and need that support. And so I'm just curious where one would read or how to even advocate for that to also be updated in every budget, is the workforce that does work in that arena.
Thanks for that question, Max. And I'm gonna give it my best shot to start out with an answer. But so we do have certain departments and certain workers that do have the unions. Like we have like SEIU, and you mentioned like the police unions and things like that, where people are fighting for their wages. But the interesting part about these other departments is they get a specific amount of dollars allocated from the county each year. And if those allocations don't increase, then the department heads don't have very much wiggle room to be able to figure out how to provide services for the people that they are serving, as well as increasing their staff salaries, which is very like sad and disheartening. And a lot of folks just continue doing the work because they're passionate about it. But ways that we can continue to advocate for those things are coming together like this, and going to budget town halls and creating relationships with department heads and board of supervisors, like each district, so we can create budget proposals and advocate. And that's a really important piece of coalition building, why like Reimagine LA is in partnership with so many different organizations, because we all have different areas of expertise, but all of these areas of expertise are extremely important, and we can come together to advocate for each other. I hope that answers the question. And if not, if there's any like follow-up or anything, please feel free to let me know. And if anyone else from the team has anything to add. Cool. We can go ahead and move forward to slide 4. Okay, so we've talked a lot about like areas that we feel like need funding. So I kind of want to go to well, I guess I'll just ask the question. Are there any specific programs or services you believe should receive more funding or to be expanded? I also want to add an additional piece to this question, asking, are there any services that you feel like are missing from our county?
More funding for single people that like have had children removed from them or been homeless for a long time, because it really takes a lot of investing to restore back an individual that has been chronically homeless for 5+ years. That becomes, they really become kind of like disabled.
I think that's a really good piece right there. I think that goes back to like what you were uplifting earlier with like life skills and financial literacy. I see the thread. And I also see services and programs led and informed by folks with lived experiences. Those need to be prioritized and funded. I agree 100%. Participatory budgeting, restorative justice, transformative justice as alternatives to incarceration, independent pretrial services and support, uplifting overrepresented and over-impacted populations in the county carceral systems, women of color, femmes, trans and gender expansive communities. So important. And I see Sarah's question is listed here too for us to dig into a little bit more. And I see more support in the chat for financial support for folks that have been chronically homeless. Okay, we can go ahead and move forward to the next question. And this question is again geared a little bit more towards service providers, which is like, are there any areas where you see a gap in funding that could affect this effectiveness on your services? And I see one thing here that Rainey mentioned in the chat earlier, funding for building spaces for CBOs providing services. And I think this is a really important gap to note because we have a lot of empty like buildings that are abandoned and a lot of like parking lots that aren't being used for anything in Los Angeles County. And as we're trying to close down Men's Central Jail, we need community resources, and a lot of like these buildings could be utilized for nonprofits to provide services. So I think that's a great call on a gap in funding.
Hi, thank you all for holding this meeting. Super informative. I think for us, one of the biggest gaps we're really recognizing is like the lack of education and information that's being not only shared but funded. So for example, like I run a grassroots small nonprofit, and I took a little over a year, I don't want to say off because I was still running it, but I joined a large nonprofit industrial complex organization to help pass SB 731. So folks like myself could qualify for expungement. And it's almost as if the 1 million+ people in Los Angeles don't even know that this is available to them, except unless you're in this little cycle. So for us, we started to really recognize like just the lack of information and funding to be able to share this type of information within the communities that we serve.
I think that's an extremely important point, especially like when we think about the CFCI program that we mentioned earlier. They give out care grants for community-based organizations that apply for them. And for those care grants, they host an ATI Incubation Academy, the Alternatives to Incarceration Incubation Academy, that helps small organizations build capacity. And a lot of organizations don't know that that's even an option. So I think that is a good call on a gap as well. Funding and services for information and public announcements about like county services that are offered. And I also see gap, worker pay, empty positions. All right. You can go ahead and move forward to the next question. We got 2 more questions, y'all. This one is, what specific feedback or suggestions do you have for improving the county budget proposal to better support the services that you provide? And I think some of this, like this can be a continuation of what Felicia just touched on, with naming that one of those suggestions that could improve the county budget is giving funding for like public information about what's available.
Not only that, I would say given making sure that the providers, those who work for these organizations, that they are properly salaried. You know, we don't get a lot of raises. Most of the people that I work with, we can't even, like, I put a young lady in a building today that I would never be able to live on my salary. So we want to make sure that we're not putting so much out there that the providers, those who are out there on the front line, they is one check away or getting swallowed under with the inflation of the economy, that they're not surviving either. And we have co-workers that are homeless, don't have a place to stay. That's kind of off, you know. So I would say salary, making sure that those who work in these fields have a decent salary.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's super important. Oh yeah, I'll pass it over to Diego.
Hi, yes, thank you. My name is Diego. I'm new with Catalyst California. I just wanted to mention on the topic of making sure that service providers are getting pay that meets the cost of living. On a sort of related topic, Catalyst is supporting Measure A, which is increasing the sales tax to improve homeless and housing services. Slightly different topic than the Care First initiative that you all are referring to. But I did just want to flag that for that Measure A, it does include language that will allow for cost of living increases for any contracts that the county does enter into with providers. In this case of Measure A, is for providing housing and homeless services. But certainly that's something that it sounds like we need to push for any county contracts to provide cost of living adjustments for the good work that you all do. So just wanted to flag that.
Thanks for that flag, Diego. Yeah, completely relevant. I think that that's super important, and it goes back to Sarah's question from earlier. Like, what are models that we can look at and we can copy, you know, to implement here? And I think that piece of Measure J is something that we can look at to advocate for different departments that are in LA County, to help our community care workers. Seeing they need the money to be audited and accountability. Yes, I agree 100%. LA County, as we talked about earlier, is not very transparent with their budget. And we wanna know what's being funded. We want itemized, we want the itemized receipt, you know. Divestment from law enforcement, providing more extensive information to the public. Needs to be transparent, addressing the nonprofit complex. The CEO should, I'm not sure what the end of that is, but I am intrigued. Cool, we can move on to, oh, go ahead.
I was just finishing a sentence. I don't know who was writing it, but I'm like, the CEO should run us our money.
That's a fun game. We could just go around. The CEO should. If Lena's still on, that's a fun note from what we've talked about before. We can go ahead and move forward to our last and final question. All right, so how do you think the suggested changes that we talked about today would impact your daily life or the lives of your family and friends? So thinking about all of the services that we just discussed and we named that would be important in LA County, what would that change for you and for other people? And feel free, throw it in the chat, put it on the Jamboard, come off mute. This question will be, well, we'll have a little closeout, but this question will be mostly closing out our time together tonight. My unhoused neighbors can access safe and stable housing and easily access supportive services. It's very powerful to me just thinking about all of my unhoused neighbors and thinking about like an easier way for them to access housing. It just like warms my heart, but also still feels far. Seeing Cecilia helping people to improve their lives and themselves instead of locking away those we would rather not see or talk about. Come on. It's so good. Helping people with these resources that we're talking about today and uplifting them instead of locking them in cages, coming together, you know, with mutual aid and support. It's definitely a world that I want to live in. Yeah, Coach Ron.
Yeah, if you know, if the funding did come through for next year for us, it would improve our livability as well as our mental state. As far as, you know, seeing more money into community cleanups, cleaning up bus stops, it would improve ridership. You know, and cleaning up clean up all these alleys, and there's a lot of these derelict properties, the abandoned properties, they can get cleaned up. It would really improve just the living conditions of the community. I just think just having some money allocated towards cleanup and sanitation and debris removal would be good for the mental health.
Yeah, thanks, Coach Ron.
You're welcome.
And it will definitely help. I know mine and Megan's mental health, because we're talking about those rodents. Okay, that was a scary statistic. Okay. seeing helping more support for our youth, a safer environment that fosters safety, growth, and stability. Students and youth having a network of care, love, and resources. Overall, what I'm hearing is like it would help people holistically, like on the financial side of things to have stability, on the mental health side of things to feel more solid in yourself and have surroundings that feel safe, and not feeling like you're constantly in danger or that someone's going to come and sweep your home away from the side of the road and things like that. So yeah, thanks y'all. We can go ahead and close out the Jamboard and move back to the slides for our closeout. Alrighty, so thank you all for such a great conversation today. Can't even hold you. I was a little nervous facilitating this conversation, but I really enjoyed being able to speak with you all, and thanks for coming off mute and speaking and throwing out all of your opinions in the chat. So here's a couple of ways to take action with us, and I wanted to just give a shout out. If you are a youth under 25 that has stayed on this whole time, I'm going to go ahead and drop my email in the chat so you can follow up with me and we can go ahead and get you your stipend for attending tonight. Actually, Jess, or yeah, could you drop my email in the chat? Thank you. So our first call to action is join us to give public comment. Sorry, y'all, my son is going in over here. But join us to give public comment at the Board of Supervisors budget hearing on October 8th. This will be the release of the supplemental budget, and we will be mobilizing to advocate and tell the community tell the Board of Supervisors what the community would like to see in their budget. And you can RSVP at this link here, reimagine.la/October 8th. There will be more information to come. We are in the beginning stages of planning for that mobilization. And then, of course, stay connected with us at reimagine.la/stay connected. You have an opportunity there to fill out your email, phone number, and like answer a couple of questions if you would like to connect further to join like one of our work groups and get down to doing this work. And then last but not least, follow us on social media at reimagine_LA. And I hope to hear from you all. We had a lot of great conversations tonight and like points about things that we would want to see funded and different ways to do that. So I would definitely love to involve you all in our work with our policy work group or with our budget econ work group. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all in this work.